In the quiet, manicured cul-de-sac of Sunnyvale Estates, Arizona, a single lawn gnome named Gerald stood proudly in Mrs. Clara Thompson's front yard, its red hat gleaming under the desert sun. By dusk, the Homeowners Association, better known as the HOA, had issued a violation notice declaring Gerald an unauthorized aesthetic disturbance and demanding his immediate removal. Clara, a 68-year-old retired schoolteacher with a penchant for quirky garden decor, was no stranger to the HOA's iron grip. Sunnyvale Estates was a gated community where every blade of grass was measured, every mailbox painted the same shade of taupe, and every deviation from the HOA's 47-page rulebook was met with swift retribution. But Gerald, a gift from her late husband, was non-negotiable. Clara had placed the gnome by her rose bushes as a quiet act of rebellion, a middle finger to the HOA's relentless control over her slice of suburbia. The violation notice arrived via certified mail, signed by HOA President Randy Whitaker, a fastidious real estate agent who treated Sunnyvale like his personal fiefdom. The letter cited Rule 14.3. No decorative lawn ornaments, figurines, or sculptures may be placed without prior approval. Clara read it aloud to her book club, a group of 5 neighbors who met weekly to sip wine and gossip about Randy's latest decrees. "They're coming for Gerald," she said, her voice trembling with indignation, "but I'm not backing down." Her neighbor, Jake Martinez, a 32-year-old mechanic with a pickup truck full of tools and a disdain for authority, slammed his glass down. "This is war, Clara. If they can take your gnome, what's next? My kid's basketball hoop? Sarah's hummingbird feeder?" Sarah Newen, a single mom and graphic designer, nodded vigorously. The book club, rounded out by elderly Mr. Goldstein, who once ran for mayor, and Priya Sharma, a young lawyer new to the neighborhood, agreed. Gerald was the hill to die on. Clara's defiance spread like wildfire. By morning, Jake had planted 3 more gnomes in his yard, each holding a tiny picket sign, "Free Gerald." Sarah added a flamingo statue, its pink legs defiantly staked into her lawn. Priya, ever the strategist, dug through the HOA bylaws, searching for loopholes. Mr. Goldstein, with his knack for storytelling, began spreading the tale of the Great Gnome Rebellion to anyone who'd listen. The neighborhood buzzed with whispers of revolt, and Randy Whitaker sensed a threat to his meticulously curated order. Randy called an urgent HOA meeting at the community clubhouse, a sterile beige building with plastic ferns and a perpetually broken coffee machine. He stood at the podium, his tie strangling his neck, and declared, "This is about standards, people. If we allow gnomes, we're one step away from rusted cars on cinder blocks." His loyalists, mostly retirees who lived for power washing their driveways, nodded in agreement. But Clara, flanked by her book club, stood up. "Gerald stays," she said, her voice steady, "and if you push me, Randy, you'll regret it." The room gasped. No one had ever challenged Randy so directly. He smirked, thinking he'd crush this uprising with a few fines and a stern letter. But Clara had a plan. She'd spent years teaching middle schoolers, and if there was one thing she knew, it was how to outsmart a bully. She whispered to Jake, "We need more gnomes, hundreds of them, by tomorrow." Jake grinned. He knew a guy who knew a guy, a supplier of novelty garden decor. By midnight, a delivery truck rolled into Sunnyvale, unloading crates of gnomes, gnomes with fishing poles, gnomes with lanterns, gnomes mooning the moon. The book club worked under cover of darkness, planting gnomes in every yard that agreed to join the rebellion. By dawn, Sunnyvale Estates was a sea of pointy hats, a surreal landscape of ceramic defiance. Randy awoke to a nightmare. His pristine neighborhood looked like a gnome convention. He stormed to Clara's house, violation notices in hand, only to find her sipping coffee on her porch, Gerald perched proudly beside her. "You've gone too far, Clara. This ends now." Clara smiled sweetly. "Oh, Randy, we're just getting started." Randy Whitaker was not a man to be trifled with. He'd built his reputation in Sunnyvale Estates by enforcing rules with the precision of a drill sergeant. Gnomes? Unacceptable. Flamingos? An abomination. By noon, he'd mobilized his HOA board, 3 loyalists named Karen, Bob, and Dolores, each with a vendetta against anything that disrupted their vision of suburban perfection. They issued fines to every household with a gnome, citing violations ranging from unapproved decorations to disturbing the aesthetic harmony. Clara, however, was ready. Priya's legal research uncovered a loophole. The HOA bylaws didn't explicitly ban temporary decorations for community events. Clara declared the gnome invasion a neighborhood gnome festival, complete with a fabricated flyer announcing a celebration of local artistry. The book club spread the word, and soon half the neighborhood was claiming their gnomes were part of the festival. Randy was livid but couldn't immediately counter the loophole without revising the bylaws, a process that required a community vote. Meanwhile, Jake's connections in the local mechanic community came through. His buddies from the garage, led by a burly guy named Tony, started a gnome guard patrol, ensuring no HOA lackey could remove the gnomes without a fight. Sarah, with her graphic design skills, created a website called Save Gerald, complete with a petition that gained 500 signatures in 48 hours. Mr. Goldstein, ever the historian, began documenting the rebellion, interviewing neighbors for a Gnome Chronicles newsletter he distributed in mailboxes. Randy escalated. He hired a lawyer, Mr. Reginald Tate, a pompous man in a 3-piece suit who specialized in HOA disputes. Tate sent cease and desist letters, threatening lawsuits if the gnomes weren't removed by week's end. He also convinced Randy to install security cameras around Sunnyvale to catch vandalism, that is, gnome placement. The neighborhood felt like a surveillance state, with residents whispering about Big Randy, watching their every move. Clara, undeterred, rallied her troops. She hosted a strategy session at her house, where the book club plotted their next move over homemade lemonade and brownies. Priya suggested they turn the HOA's own rules against them. She flipped through a binder of documents. Randy's board hasn't filed their annual financial report, she said. That's a violation of state law. We can demand an audit. Jake proposed a bolder tactic: infiltrate the HOA board. If we get one of us elected, we can change the rules from the inside, he said, cracking his knuckles. The rebellion gained momentum. Neighbors who'd once cowered under Randy's rule began joining the cause. Mrs. Lopez, a quiet widow, donated a gnome dressed as a mariachi player. The Kim family added a gnome in a chef's hat, holding a tiny spatula. Even the HOA's own treasurer, Bob, started wavering, confiding to Clara that he was tired of Randy's tyranny. The neighborhood was no longer just fighting for Gerald, it was fighting for freedom. Randy, sensing the tide turning, called another HOA meeting, this time with a PowerPoint presentation titled The Dangers of Gnome Anarchy. He warned of plummeting property values, citing a dubious study about lawn clutter reducing home sales by 15%. His loyalists clapped, but the room was divided. Clara stood again, holding a gnome-shaped cookie jar. This isn't about gnomes. It's about our right to live in our homes without fear of your clipboard, Randy. The meeting ended in chaos, with neighbors shouting over each other. Randy stormed out, vowing to crush the rebellion. That night, someone, nobody knew who, spray-painted "Gnome Lives Matter" on the clubhouse door. The war was on.
The Gnome Festival loophole held for now, but Randy wasn't done. He hired a landscaping company to accidentally remove gnomes under the guise of routine maintenance. The company, led by a shady contractor named Vince, rolled into Sunnyvale with a truck full of weed whackers and a mission to clear the lawns. But Jake and his gnome guard were ready. They formed a human chain around Clara's yard, chanting, "Hell no, gnomes won't go." Vince, not paid enough to deal with a mob, backed off, leaving half the gnomes intact. Clara's book club took the rebellion to new heights. Sarah launched a social media campaign, #Gnome Rebellion, which went viral after a local news station covered the story. The hashtag trended on X, with users sharing their own HOA horror stories. A teenager in the neighborhood, Mia, created a TikTok dance called the Gnome Shuffle, which racked up 1 million views. Sunnyvale Estates became a national talking point, with late-night comedians joking about the Great Arizona Gnome Uprising. Priya, meanwhile, filed a formal complaint with the state demanding an audit of the HOA's finances. She discovered that Randy had been skimming HOA funds into questionable projects, like a $10,000 consulting fee to his cousin's company. The audit request put Randy on edge. He started avoiding neighbors, darting into his house whenever Clara or Jake appeared. Jake, ever the tactician, organized a gnome parade to keep morale high. Neighbors marched through Sunnyvale, pushing wheelbarrows full of gnomes, accompanied by a boombox blasting Sweet Home Alabama. Even Mr. Goldstein joined, waving a gnome like a flag. The parade drew a crowd, including curious onlookers from neighboring communities. Randy watched from his window, his face a mask of fury. The turning point came when Bob, the HOA treasurer, defected. He met Clara in secret, handing over a USB drive with financial records. "Randy's been skimming. I can't keep covering for him." Clara, Priya, and Jake pored over the documents, finding evidence of misallotted funds, enough to force a recall election for the HOA board. But Randy had one last trick. He convinced the HOA's lawyer, Tate, to file an injunction against the Gnome Festival, arguing it was a public nuisance. A court hearing was set for the following week. Clara knew they had to act fast. She called an emergency book club meeting where they decided to run Jake for HOA president. His platform? Gnomes for all, tyranny for none. The court hearing was a circus. Clara, Jake, Priya, Sarah, and Mr. Goldstein packed the courtroom, each wearing a gnome-shaped lapel pin. Randy and Tate arrived with a stack of legal documents, confident they'd crush the rebellion. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Alvarez, raised an eyebrow at the case title. Sunnyvale Estates HOA versus the Gnome Festival. Priya, representing the rebels pro bono, presented their case. The HOA's rules were overly restrictive, the fines were punitive, and Randy's financial misconduct warranted an investigation. She submitted Bob's USB drive as evidence, causing Tate to sputter objections. Clara took the stand, recounting how Gerald was a tribute to her late husband. "This isn't just about a gnome," she said, her voice cracking. "It's about our homes, our memories, our freedom." Randy's testimony was a disaster. He rambled about standards and property values, but when Judge Alvarez asked about the financial records, he turned pale. Tate tried to pivot, arguing the gnomes were a safety hazard, but the judge wasn't buying it. "I see no evidence these gnomes pose a threat," she said, stifling a smile. The courtroom erupted when Jake took the stand, wearing a t-shirt with Gerald's face and the words, "Gnome Sweet Gnome." He spoke passionately about community, about neighbors coming together to fight petty tyranny. "Randy doesn't own Sunnyvale, he do." The gallery cheered, earning a stern gavel from Judge Alvarez. The judge ruled in favor of the rebels, dismissing the injunction and ordering an immediate audit of the HOA's finances. She also granted a temporary suspension of all gnome-related fines, pending a community vote on the bylaws. Clara hugged Jake, tears in her eyes, as the courtroom emptied. Back in Sunnyvale, the rebels celebrated with a block party, complete with gnome-shaped cupcakes and a banner reading, "Victory for Gerald." But Randy wasn't done. He launched a smear campaign, spreading rumors that Clara was planning to turn Sunnyvale into a hippie commune. He also rallied his loyalists for the upcoming HOA election, determined to keep his throne. The HOA election was the final battle. Jake ran against Randy, with Clara as his campaign manager. Sarah designed posters with the slogan, "Vote Jake, Save the Gnomes." Priya drafted a new set of bylaws, loosening restrictions on lawn decor and requiring financial transparency. Mr. Goldstein went door to door, sharing the Gnome Chronicles with every household. Randy fought dirty, spreading flyers accusing Jake of being a gnome extremist. But the audit results, released days before the election, sealed his fate. The report confirmed Randy's financial misconduct, including $20,000 in questionable expenses. Neighbors who'd once feared him now saw him as a crook. On election day, Sunnyvale turned out in droves. Clara set up a voting booth decorated with, you guessed it, gnomes. When the results were announced, Jake won by a landslide. Randy slunk away, his clipboard abandoned. The new bylaws passed, allowing tasteful lawn decorations and mandating open HOA meetings. Clara's gnome, Gerald, remained proudly in her yard, now joined by a plaque reading, "The gnome that started it all." Sunnyvale Estates transformed into a vibrant community, with flamingos, gnomes, and even a life-size dinosaur statue, courtesy of Jake. The book club became the new HOA board, with Jake as president, Priya as legal counsel, and Sarah handling community outreach. Years later, Sunnyvale became a tourist attraction, dubbed Gnomeville, USA. Visitors came to see the quirky lawns and hear the story of the Great Gnome Rebellion. Clara, now in her 70s, wrote a memoir, Gnome Sweet Gnome, which became a bestseller. Jake opened a garage specializing in custom gnome repairs. And Gerald? He stood watch over Sunnyvale, a symbol of defiance, community, and the power of standing up to petty tyrants.